Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Book of Fables. Last time when I did the donkey skin girl, Elelyra, I mentioned in the thread on Something Awful that it wasn't the happiest fable in the world, and someone shot back that it wasn't the saddest. And so I thought, we should do the saddest fairy tale in the world, and while there may be sadder ones, this is definitely the fairy tale that comes to mind, and it's changed enough in interpretations over the years that I think it will be a very interesting one to do. And it also has some personal history. My dad used to read me Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen fables back when I was a kid, but we were always forbidden from reading this one because my grandmother would read it to my mother, a grandmother or great aunt, I can't actually remember which, would read it to my mother when she was a little girl. And it would cause my mother to just cry and cry when she was a little girl, because this is such a sad story. And so I figured we'd read it and talk about its different interpretations through the years. So let's get ready to get sad as I read The Little Match Girl. Most terribly cold it was. It snowed and was quite nearly dark, an evening, the last evening of the year. In this cold and darkness they went along the street, poor little girl, bareheaded with naked feet. When she left home she had slippers on, it is true, but what was the good of that? They were very large slippers, which her mother had hitherto worn. So large were they, and the poor little thing had lost them as she shuffled away across the street because of two carriages that rolled by dreadfully fast. One slipper was nowhere to be found, the other had been laid hold of by an urchin, and off he ran with it. He thought it would do capitally for a cradle when he some day or the other should have children himself. So the little maiden walked on with her tiny naked feet, that were quite red and blue from cold. She carried a quantity of matches in an old apron, and she held a bundle of them in her hand. Nobody had bought anything of her the whole livelong day. No one had given her a single farthing. She crept along trembling with cold and hunger, a very picture of sorrow, the poor little thing. The flakes of snow covered her long fair hair, which fell in beautiful curls around her neck. But of that, of course, she never once now thought. From all the windows the candles were gleaming, and it smelt so deliciously of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve. Yes, of that she thought. In a corner, formed by two houses, of which one advanced more than the other, she seated herself down and cowered together. Her little feet she had drawn close up to her, but she grew colder and colder, and to go home she did not venture, for she had sold not any matches, and could not bring a farthing of money. From her father she would certainly get blows, and at home it was cold too, for above her she had only the roof, through which the wind whistled, even though the largest cracks were stopped up with straw and rags. Her little hands were almost numbed with cold. Oh! A match might afford her a world of comfort, if only she dared take a single one out of the bundle, draw it against the wall, and warm her fingers by it. She drew out one. Risht! How it blazed, how it burnt! It was a warm, bright flame like a candle as she held her hands over it. It was a wonderful light. It seemed really to the little maiden as though she were sitting before a large iron stove with burnished brass feet and a brass ornament atop. The fire burned with such blessed influence, it warmed so delightfully. The little girl had already stretched out her feet to warm them too, but the small flame went out, the stove vanished. She had only the remains of the burnt-out match in her hand. She rubbed another against the wall, burned brightly, and where the light fell on the wall, there the wall became transparent like a veil, so she could see into the room. On the table was spread a snow-white tablecloth, and upon it was a splendid porcelain service, and the roast goose was steaming famously with its stuffing of apple and dried plums. And what was still more capital to behold was the goose hopped down from the dish, reeled about on the floor with knife and fork on its breast, till it came up to the poor little girl, when the match went out, and nothing but the thick, cold, damp wall was left behind. She lighted another match. Now there she was, sitting under the most magnificent Christmas tree. It was still larger and more decorated than the one which she had seen through the glass door in the rich merchant's house. Thousands of lights were burning on the green branches, and gaily colored pictures, such as she had seen on the shop windows, looked down upon her. The little maiden stretched out her hands towards them when the match went out. The lights of the Christmas tree rose higher and higher. She saw them now as stars in heaven. One fell down and formed a long train of fire. "Someone is just dead," said the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only person who had loved her and who was now no more, had told her that when a star falls, a soul ascends to God. She drew another match against the wall. It was again light, and in the luster there stood the old grandmother, so bright and radiant, so mild, with such an expression of love. "Grandmother," cried the little one, "oh, take me with you. You go away when the match burns out. You vanish like the warm stove, like the delicious roast goose, and like the magnificent Christmas tree." And she rubbed the whole bundle of matches quickly against the wall, for she wanted to be quite sure of keeping her grandmother near her. And the matches gave such a brilliant light that it was brighter than at noonday. Never formerly had the grandmother been so beautiful and tall. She took the little maiden on her arm, and both flew in brightness and in joy, so high, so very high, and then above was neither cold, nor hunger, nor anxiety. They were with God, but in the corner, the cold hour of dawn, sat the poor girl, with rosy cheeks and with a smiling mouth, leaning against the wall, frozen to death on the last evening of the old year. Stiff and stark sat the child there with her matches, of which one bundle had been burnt. She wanted to warm herself, people said. No one had the slightest suspicion of what beautiful things she had seen. No one even dreamed of the splendor in which, with her grandmother, she had entered on the joys of a new year. Dang! That is a pretty sad story. I'm not going to say it's the saddest fairy tale out there, because I'm sure somebody will contradict me and find something that's somehow even sadder, but that is pathetic. So, this is a really interesting story to me, both because of its subject matter and because of the way it's interpreted. A lot of fairy tales deal with mystical and magical elements, just as this one does, in a non-obvious way, in a way that's open to interpretation. So, bizarrely to me, when Hans Christian Andersen wrote this, he thought it was a story with a happy ending. Regardless of the fact that the little girl froze to death, his vision was, and I guess we know this from his notes, was that the little matchstick girl, genuinely was seeing a vision of her grandmother at the end and entered into heaven with her, and then into all of the joys of the things that she saw before. There would be a Christmas tree, and in some way it was, also the stars in the heavens that she was ascending to, and that she would have enough to eat, and that she would be around people that cared for her. And so to him, this was actually a happy ending, but then it's interesting to me that the actual story ends with the description of her the next day, frozen to death. And so it really doesn't shy away from its grim subject matter. Now, other people have written things about how what she goes through, the signs that she's seeing, and the kind of hallucinations, you could argue, that she's having closely mirror the process of hypothermia and freezing to death. So it's in some ways a fairly realistic portrayal of what it might be like to freeze to death if you were just a very small person. So obviously interpretations of this have varied a great deal depending on who is interpreting them, what kind of agenda and belief system that they have. Hans Christian Andersen was a deeply religious person, as we said, and saw this as an essentially hopeful tale. But I'm also a religious person. I'm Christian. I share that faith with Hans Christian Andersen, but I would have basically the opposite interpretation, and my mom would too. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't see this as a hopeful tale or even as a good ending. If anything, it's a story that, if it's told, ought to be told alongside all the happy stories of Christmas, to remind people that even with all of the joy and excess and luxury that we pay for during the holidays, there are people who are starving and who are in trouble, and would interpret this as just a way to keep that suffering in our minds, and would see the value that way. Other people have obviously interpreted it that way. People who don't take a religious tract at all would certainly see this girl as somebody who is just hallucinating and died this unjust death. Really, I think what's so interesting about this story is it takes something which was a real subject matter at the time. There were plenty of beggars at the time that this story was collected and written about. The fact that she's selling matchsticks is apparently because the time and place when Hans Christian Andersen was collecting his stories, begging was illegal. And so in order to cover for begging, people would have these things which were very cheap to make, like matches, and would get a whole bunch of them and pretend like, oh, they're selling matches, but really what they're doing is begging. And were sort of seen beneath the notice of the population. And so there were many, many cases of them freezing to death. They didn't have the care or the shelters in cold like there are today for people who were indigent. And so he took this real subject matter and wrote about it in this very touching, very moving way. And while he may have had an agenda of his own and may have had a belief system of his own about, you know, what an appropriate story was for this little girl and what a happy ending would be like, didn't force it on the story. Again, you know, keep in mind that while the story ends for the little girl with her potentially ascending into heaven to be with her grandmother, the final words of the story deal with her frozen the next morning. And so, really, this story shows very clearly what a lot of fables and fairy tales show, which I think is interesting, is that their subject matter is meant in some way to be a mirror of things we experience in a daily life, and to help us process those somehow. And so, the reactions that people have, again, varied throughout the ages. People who read the story today, and there are retellings of it that are written today, tend to focus on the big difference between the very expensive inner parties where things are going on and there's a lot of commercialization and there's a lot of focus on material wealth, and then the relative poverty and the overlooking of people who are suffering. And so the story, when it's written today, I read a story, a modern retelling of it that was set in this very big impersonal city, and it was supposed to be telling a tale of alienation and of separation of people of different economic classes, because those are the concerns of today. And we can definitely read that into this story, or you can read it as a religious fable, or you can read it as a religious exhortation, you know, to say, how can these people be celebrating inside when there's such poverty going along outside of there? Doesn't the Bible exhort us to say, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me, says God incarnate, basically. And aren't we commanded to show charity? And so it's interesting that no one in the story cared for her or gave her any money at all, or there weren't any resources available to her. Or can you interpret the whole thing metaphorically, as has been done, to highlight the difference between the individual who suffers alone and who only can experience the joy that other people have through illusion? And so it might be a metaphor for someone who's deeply depressed and surrounded by people that at least they see as much happier, trying to conjure up some of that feeling in themselves and it fading away in sort of this cold, dark world. Or might it be interpreted from a Marxist perspective, where it's really sort of a polemic in that case against capitalism and against the systems that isolate people and drive them into the ground? Apparently she came from this chain of poverty that existed at least since her grandmother, and her father as well is not able to provide for the family and kept out of having a good family life, and so he harms his daughter and is cruel to her, and it forces this girl to die. So it's really, it changes a lot. The subject matter remains the same, and I think in that we can see a lot of the power of fairy tales, especially in this very dark and depressing one. I'd be interested to hear, if people want to post in the thread, what reactions they have to the little matchstick girl. I've shared a little bit of mine that, again, I come from a religious tradition which is the same as Hans Christian Andersen, but I really had the opposite effect on me as it did on him. I don't see this as a hopeful story. I see it as a provocative one. And so if anybody else wants to say how it affected them, I think that would be great. And I was really glad that somebody mentioned this in the thread, because I had it in my mind that I wanted to do, but really digging into this and seeing the different interpretations, seeing how they changed throughout the years, but seeing how the subject matter itself, this real-world example being presented with elements of the fantastic, allowing us to see ourselves and to see the way we view the world in this story, is just so powerful and so cool. So, thanks a lot, and I hope you join me next time for Book of Fables.